if you want to understand why I have a disease and you don't, that's really a question mostly about which genes are turned on in me and aren't turned on in you, and how they have over a long time, through some kind of organized conspiracy, built a damaged piece of tissue that isn't serving the health and well-being of my body as a whole.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Thrive State Podcast. It's your host, Dr. V, triple board certified MD, as well as a performance and longevity doctor. And today we've got a very special episode. It is actually the summer of 2021, but we're going to go back in time to one of the original interviews I did with a very prominent figure, Dr. Stephen Cole. He's a colleague at UCLA and one of the world experts in the field of epigenetics. Epi means above, genetics, genes. And the study of epigenetics tells us this, that it's actually factors that are above the genes that actually determine how our DNA is expressed and in turn, how our cells behave. So when we talk about the Thrive state, that's the energy that we give ourselves to have optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. If we give ourselves the wrong cues, or if we give our DNA the wrong cues, our cells are actually in a suboptimal state, or what I call the stress and survive state. That's when we have chronic symptoms. That's when we get chronic disease. So this work on epigenetics is so important, but it empowers you. It tells us this. What is DNA? Well, DNA is something we get one strand from mom, one strand from dad. And together, this double-stranded helix actually has all the genes that are in the body, all the plays in the playbook that you could currently have. But every cell is a little bit different, right? Our heart cell is different from an eye cell, different from a skin cell, different from a lung cell. They're all different, but they have the same DNA. Why is that? Well, that's because certain genes are being turned off and certain genes are being turned on. That's what makes each cell different. How each cell performs, the state of each cell is also determined by how this DNA is being played out. So not everything in our DNA is being expressed at any given moment. And what determines the expression of the DNA? Well, that's epigenetics. This is the bioenergetic state. This is what I talk about in my book, Thrive State. And if you haven't picked up a copy already, pick up your copy at thrivestatebook.com. I'm also super excited. If you actually want to join and learn about how you get into a Thrive state with a group of people learning from me on videos as well as live on video, go to the Thrive State Accelerator. That's kienvuu.com/accelerator. In that course, we're going to go deep into how you get into the Thrive state, how you master the 7 bioenergetic elements. Why I wanted to go back to this interview today is the work done by Stephen Cole, as well as many of the epigeneticists in the world, empowers us that it is our choices, our thoughts, the things that we do every day that impact DNA expression, and not what we were actually born with, not the things that we got from mom and dad, but instead how we live our life impacts that DNA and our cellular health, and also whether we're in the Thrive state or the stress state. So I invite you right now. This is a very, very special episode. And at the end of this episode, you'll know that really it is you that's your best medicine. It is you that is the driver of your DNA expression. So join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Cole for this very, very special interview. Welcome, everybody, Dr. Steve Cole.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So the word epigenetics is elusive to some, but epigenetics is a field of research that really tells us that people have more control over their health and their gene expression more than they think.
Yeah, that's right. So I think genetics, has this image in people's minds as being about rocks, basically like DNA that's laid down at birth and, affects you every single day of your life. And whatever genes you got dealt when you were born, that's what you're keeping until the day you die. And oh, by the way, those genes are going to determine the day you die, right? Mm-hmm. So almost everything I just told you is untrue, we have discovered. And a lot of this comes back to us trying to understand how bodies work, how they live and thrive, and sort of basically when they go bad and how they die. So A lot of us, like our conscious experience of our bodies is that like we are solid, immutable creatures, just like that much vaunted DNA, that we are, like I feel like I'm the same person today as I was a month ago, and I'll be the same person regardless of whether I'm here talking to you or out there surfing today in the rain or hanging out on some mountain in Peru or something like this, right? But what we have learned when we try and understand how bodies work is that in fact we change a lot more than we're aware of. Every day, millions of our cells, actually billions of our cells die, and they need to get reproduced to keep us going. I'm constantly being rebuilt, and that process of rebuilding leaves us sort of plastic. It leaves us vulnerable to influence by the environment around us, including the parts of the environment that we ourselves create. That's one of the sort of the weird things about genetics. Geneticists think of the environment as everything besides DNA. That is everything we think, feel. To them, that's the environment. To us, the environment is like trees and mountains and stuff like that. But what we've learned when we try and understand how bodies stay healthy and when they get sick is really that this constant self-regeneration process, which is mediated by turning on and turning off genes. Genes aren't on all the time. They get turned on, they get turned off. That's really what epigenetics is all about, this process of activating and deactivating the genes that we already have encoded in our DNA, and the role that our lives and the worlds that we inhabit and the worlds that we create play in that process of turning genes on and turning them off.
And is that why we can have the exact same DNA in every single one of our cells, but each cell might be a little different?
Yeah.
One's a hair cell, one's a heart cell, one's a muscle cell. This is turning on and turning off of genes.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. So genes, we have the same set of about 20,000 DNA-based genes in every single cell of our bodies, but the fact that an eyeball cell is an eyeball cell and not a brain cell or a toe cell, all of that stuff is shaped by what's going on in the activation or deactivation of those genes. Which genes are turned on, which genes are turned off. So really, I mean, that's what causes our bodies to be shaped the way they are, what causes an eyeball to be an eyeball and not an ear or a brain or a toe. All of that basically is dictated by which genes are turned on in a cell and which genes are turned off. And epigenetics, broadly speaking, is the science of turning genes on and turning them off in response to the world that we live in.
Right. And would you say disease states, or disease as we have it, would that be basically a combination of certain genes being turned off and certain genes being turned off as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So disease, and this is really how we learned about epigenetics and gene regulation, is that, you and I, broadly speaking, have the same genome. Individual human beings are, more than 99% identical at the DNA level. But if I've got a case of metastatic cancer, it turns out the answer to why I've got that and you don't doesn't lie, by and large, in the DNA that we inherited. It lies mostly in which of those genes get turned on in my life and not in your life.
Right. Now, what are some of these external factors and clues that turns things on and off? Is it how we live our lives? Is it the thoughts that we think? Is it the diet we're eating? All of those?
Yeah, all of the above. So you can think of there as being sort of like a set of votes coming in from different directions, all impinging on our DNA and jointly determining which genes win, which genes get activated, and which genes lose, which genes get locked out. And in any given cell, about half of the genome is silent at any given point in time. In other words, it's by no means the default state that the genes are active. They actually are tuned to activate or deactivate in response to all kinds of things in life. The things we eat, like you say, exercise, even sort of the degree of stress that we experience influences gene expression, chemicals in our environment, benzene in the drinking water or radon in the house. Just about everything that impacts our health ultimately does so by turning on or turning off these genes. So you can think of it as like life is ordering up from the menu of our genome some particular recipe about how a cell should be. And if that recipe is good, then we live and thrive and sort of bloom as human beings. If that recipe goes wrong, though, and almost nothing goes wrong in the sense of being purely evil, but there's all kinds of ways in which, for instance, we might turn on a defense program in ourselves. We actually know this is one of the ways that stress kills people, is that, stress responses usually are activated for defensive purposes. We've got a whole bunch of programs wired into our genome that turn on when we feel threatened or uncertain. The modern world that we live in, especially in kind of capitalist Western societies, it keeps us feeling threatened or uncertain all the time, because that is really highly productive, right? We're all out competing for more grants or space on the freeway, or I got to buy a nice house on the hill or something like that. But that chronic sense of, what have you done for me lately? I need to do more, I need to do better. That causes, when it interacts with the way our genomes are wired, that causes the activation of a bunch of defense programs that originally were built to protect us from being wounded, right? So not so much protect us from being wounded, but as help our tissues when it is wounded.
Right, because those were adapted because we might sense a saber-toothed tiger or a lion is in the midst of our past, and we need to be able to activate ourselves to protect ourselves in the event that we get wounded. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So most of the way the human body works was laid down in the Pleistocene, right? So back then you had like 80 people hanging out in a small village around a campfire. They spent about a third of their time, sort of picking berries and hunting beasts to eat. They spent another third of their time hanging out by the fire socializing, it turns out. They weren't like dying all the time. That came later. Humans invented all kinds of crazy ways to live that turned out not to be good. But back in the circumstances where our genome was actually wired to function optimally, we led a pretty chilled out existence most of the time. Every once in a while, though, the saber-toothed tiger came running through the camp, or the village next door decided they were going to raid us. And so for very short periods of time, we were completely freaked out. And so the human body is built to turn on these defensive responses in this kind of really spiky way. In other words, we're supposed to chill most of the time, be freaked out, terrified for a short period of time, and mount all of these biological adaptations at the cellular and molecular level to help defend us against the saber-toothed tiger's bite, or the spear from the angry villager next door, or something like that. But most of the time, we're supposed to be hanging out around the fire with the people we care about, swapping stories, learning about how to, get the right berries or kill the right meat for lunch or something like that. We were built for large periods of relaxation and high degrees of social integration. And the culture that we have, sort of progressively adapted from that early kind of primordial human experience is much more atomized. We're much more kind of separated from other people. We're much more competitive with them. We used to be mostly around collaboration. We all got to hang out together because that's how we're going to survive. And now it's much more kind of competition and survival of the fittest within the human race. And all of that stuff turns on these threat defense systems, which were originally built to protect us from the saber-toothed tiger and the neighboring villager's spear. That's all stuff that's going to wound our tissue. So we're programmed to, for instance, activate inflammatory genes, turn on a bunch of early-stage immune responses that are going to try and protect us against the infections we get from that wounding injury. The problem is most of the things that stress us out these days, things like being stuck in traffic or, trying to get a grant for your research or get more listeners to your, sort of programming about, health and well-being, all the stuff that we worry about is kind of subtly turning on that defensive program. And it does it every day, every hour sometimes, right? And that kind of constant activation of this threat defense biology, that's not the way we were built to live. And so that ends up producing dysfunctional responses that end up serving as fuel or fertilizer for all of the major diseases that now kill us, which aren't infectious diseases. That's what used to get us.
Right.
Sort of like an infection from the saber-toothed tiger or a respiratory infection from our sort of friends in the village or something like that. What kills us now is heart attacks, neurodegenerative diseases, and metastatic cancer. Most people back in the Pleistocene didn't live long enough to experience those outcomes, but we now do, and those are the things that we now worry about. Those are the things that shape lifespans and health spans, how long you stay healthy and vibrant.
And underneath all that is a foundation of actually an immune system that's not working very well and inflammation. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, another way to put it is an immune system that's working too well. It's an immune system that lives in a pretty clean world compared to what we used to live in. Remember, we mostly lived in dirt and bugs and, dead animal tissue back then, right? So now we live in these very, very clean environments, and we've got an immune system that's programmed to go out and effectively to hunt stuff, but it's got nothing to hunt in the clean lives that we lead nowadays. So our immune systems tend to be really over-exuberant about the slightest little provocations. You put that together with the fact that stress is constantly goosing the immune system and saying, get ready to be hurt, get ready to defend yourself against an infection. That translates in the immune system's sort of programming into get ready to make more inflammation.
Right.
And that inflammation is great at protecting you against wounding injuries. The problem is that the side effect of that is fertilizing the growth of an atherosclerotic plaque that is going to kind of block your coronary artery and give you a heart attack, or accelerate the demise of the neurons in your brain, or the same inflammation contributes to the metastasis of cancer cells. When DNA gets broken by the kind of wear and tear of existence, it can escape from where a cell was initially born if it gets this kind of threat biology signaling, changing the way the genes that control cellular activity work.
Well, stress sounds like a major factor that contributes to disease. What are some other lifestyle issues? Is sleep, something that has epigenetic contributions to how your genes work?
Yeah, the
in your
answer
immune
is
system?
there's nothing that doesn't have epigenetic influences. Like basically everything that becomes a risk factor for disease is on some level operating through this level of kind of molecular analysis at the level of genomes. And then, in fact, that's why we in biology study epigenetics, is if you want to understand why I have a disease and you don't, that's really a question mostly about which genes are turned on in me and aren't turned on in you, and how they have over a long time, through some kind of organized conspiracy, built a damaged piece of tissue that isn't serving the health and well-being of my body as a whole. So everything from diet to, sort of environmental chemicals, experiences of threat and adversity, especially early in life when we're laying down the basic programming of how our body is going to work, all of those things contribute. On some level, that's terrible, right? All this bad stuff is happening to us, and it's making its way into our body and kind of laying down sort of cells and proteins and molecular machinery that are shaped by that adversity. But the good news is that every piece of permeability we have, every piece of plasticity, every way we can be influenced by the environment can also be turned for good, right? So it turns out we're not cursed by the DNA that our parents gave us. That stuff is there as a menu of options. But which recipe we order off of that menu of options, that's up to us. That's something that we actually can control in a wide variety of ways. Just about everything we do in life in terms of the decisions we make about how to live, where to live, who to live with, what kind of a lifestyle to pursue, all of that stuff changes the way this machinery works, for better or for worse. And so it's really up to us, in no small part, to determine how the potential that's laid down in our genome is actually realized in the particular version of the body that I have. My DNA could have been a wide variety of other alternative Steve bodies, basically, and which one I ended up with, unfortunately in my case, still, nonetheless, is shaped by, in large, by the decisions I make in my life, the places I go, the things I do, the circumstances that I inhabit.
This episode of the Thrive State podcast is brought to you by the Thrive State Accelerator. The Thrive State Accelerator is actually a home course that I developed using the exact same techniques I work with my celebrity clients, CEOs, and executives on how to get them to the Thrive State. The Thrive State Accelerator teaches you how to master your 7 bioenergetic elements. That's sleep, nutrition, movement, stress and emotional mastery, relationships, our thoughts and mindset, as well as purpose. In this Thrive State Accelerator, you're also going to get a bonus module on optimization. That's how I talk about supplementation, peptides, all the optimization techniques I use with my clients to get them to the Thrive State. Now, for some of you who are just joining us for the first time, you guys might be wondering, what is the Thrive State? Well, the Thrive State is actually the energy, the epigenetic environment we give to ourselves, telling our DNA how to act and how to respond. And if we want optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, if we can master these 7 bioenergetic elements, our ability to have those 3 things that we just said, optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, is at its greatest. And it also prevents you from getting chronic symptoms like brain fog, being overweight, feeling sluggish, acne, pain, all these chronic symptoms, as well as preventing you from getting chronic disease. So getting to that thrive state is really getting to that state to master being that very best version of yourself so you could show up for you, for your family, for your business, everything that's important to you. So go ahead, check it out right now at kienvuu.com/accelerator and use coupon code podcast25 for 25% off. Now back to the podcast.
Now, each external factor that has the potential to affect our DNA will affect you maybe a little bit differently than it affects me. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And there's 2 reasons for that. The reason that most people are familiar with is that my DNA isn't strictly, literally at 100% identical to your DNA. So a lot of people think that the differences in the way life impacts us are largely a byproduct of the differences in our genetics. That's easy to say when genetics is a black box. But the problem with modern biotechnology is, it's no longer a black box. When somebody says there's a genetic basis for this, that, or the other thing, we've got the tools to find that now. And so if somebody says, well, this is probably genetic, and then we go out there with those tools and we can't find the gene that drives that difference, guess what? That, this assumption that it's genetic turns out not to be, sort of particularly true. So what's going on there if the same environment is affecting you differently from me? A lot of it has to do with the history of your life. So who you are right now is a byproduct to some extent of your DNA, but even more so, your DNA working through a bunch of life experiences, starting off when you were a little kid, and you've got really exciting early life stories to talk about, right? That stuff has changed the way your body works. If you had been born in a different environment where you didn't have such dramatic early life experiences, you would be shaped differently by that. The way your DNA kind of gets translated into RNA, and then the way that RNA feeds forward over time, influencing the next round of influences. In other words, the experience you have, your history, shapes the way you're going to respond to events that happen to you today. And that, to some extent, changes the trajectory of who you'll be into the future.
So that brings up an interesting question about what you actually inherit. Now, could instances of how genes get expressed in your parents' level, your grandparents' level, or even several generations back lead to how you are at this point? And is there an opportunity to shift that?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most interesting domains of epigenetics, is this notion of so-called vertical transmission, the idea that, in fact, who you are today is shaped not only by the life circumstances that you've inhabited, but to some extent by the life circumstances that your parents inhabited. Because it's your parents' biology that shapes the activity of the eggs and the sperm that will come together to create the first early version of you, which is then going to kind of develop out initially in utero, but then eventually in contact with a world and a set of life circumstances and experiences. So, for instance, we've learned that some of the epigenetic dynamics that happen where we can, for instance, get certain genes kind of locked down through a bunch of biochemical modifications that essentially blanket the genome in a certain region and prevent it from physically interacting with stimuli from the outside world. That kind of dynamic can be shaped in, let's say, your life, and in subtle effects sometimes influence the way, for example, DNA is being methylated in the germ cells that you will then pass on to your children. And when those germ cells then become a newborn human being, there's going to be a fingerprint of your experiences translated into these epigenetic modifications that affects the way that DNA will become a new ball of cells and eventually develop out into a whole human being. So it's kind of freaky to think that, oh my gosh, I'm making some bad decisions. Not only is this going to mess up my life, but it's going to curse my children and my grandchildren for generations to come. So it's kind of on some level, sort of a heavy burden on your shoulders. But the good news is that the good decisions you make will also condition your biology in ways that have favorable implications for your progeny.
So you mentioned the word methylation. So just for the viewers, what are some of the ways a gene could get turned on and turned off?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
There's 2 or 3 different ways that really matter a lot for most of our cells. The dominant one, the single most important one, involves some kind of chemical messenger, either generated by our body or sometimes environmental chemicals, that interact with receptors on the surface of cells. You can think of those as the eyes and the ears of a cell. And those receptors, or the sensory apparatus of a cell, basically gets translated into a biochemical cascade that ultimately activates a protein to bind onto DNA. That protein we call a transcription factor. And you can think of it as like a flag that lands in a particular part of your DNA and flags that stretch to be copied into RNA that will eventually become protein, which is when DNA is really active. DNA by itself doesn't do much in a cell. DNA needs to get transcribed into RNA and then translated into proteins. And it's the proteins that are actually the muscles of a cell. They're the things that do stuff. They're the things that form a receptor that allows the cell to see something, forms, a piece of the cell's skeleton that allows it to move, or forms the template for creating a molecule that will signal to another cell, I'm your friend, let's bind together, or let's get together and kill that bad bacteria or something like that. So everything that cells do involves creating or modifying the activity of proteins. And the major way that happens is through these receptor-mediated systems, the cell's sensory apparatus, activating these transcription factors that change the protein complement. Now that whole story, you can think of it as like a flow of information from the environment around us, even the environment inside our bodies, down onto the DNA. And then the DNA has been structured by literally millions of years of evolution to respond to a particular environmental stimulus at a chemical level, at least, in a particular fashion. A particular set of genes gets turned on, and the rest of the genome remains silent. It's deaf to that particular stimulus. However, that deafness also can be modified by experience. So if you think of the environment as descending onto DNA and sort of bouncing off of it, if you will, and the DNA is going to make some RNA and some protein, and that's going to go out and change the cellular function in a way that effectively modifies the environment of the body. One way to sort of mess with that system is to render the DNA partially deaf to the incoming flow of information. And there's a variety of ways that happens, but one characteristic epigenetic modification involves the addition of methyl groups to the DNA itself. So that you can think of the methyl groups as being like a big blanket that gets wrapped around the DNA. So that normally information from the outside world, which would land on the DNA and change its behavior, suddenly that stuff just bounces off the blanket. It doesn't hit the DNA, doesn't change the DNA's behavior, doesn't order up the production of any new RNA or proteins or that kind of thing.
So that gene is essentially silenced at that point.
At that point, it's at the very least, I think it's probably more accurate to think of it as deaf. It can't hear the environment, and therefore it can't speak back to the environment.
Now, are there ways of reversing that?
Yeah, there are. So you can send in drugs that will mess with those methylation groups. That's one thing we do in tissue cultures. But as you might imagine, just willy-nilly turning on all the genes that have been silenced by this kind of methylation is a recipe for cancer and a bunch of other bad diseases. So a much more sort of healthy version of this is changing the set of signals that controls which genes are methylated. And that is really what you're talking about earlier when you were talking about what in the world around us, in the lives that we lead, modifies epigenetics. Everything does. So changing the way your life works, the life that you lead, the circumstances you inhabit, the things you do, the lifestyle you pursue, all of that stuff, it turns out, is operating through these epigenetic dynamics, including transcription factors and DNA methylation. So a much better idea is to live your life in a way that is fundamentally healthy. You can think of the epigenetics as just one way of understanding what health is. But the problem is it's really complicated. We got 20,000 genes, we've got hundreds, maybe thousands of epigenetic modifiers of each of those genes. Trying to keep track of all that stuff in a big Excel spreadsheet, that's going to be a challenge, right? That's not the easy way to do it. The easier way to do it is to figure out when you're doing well, when you feel well, when you are leading a life that works for you, and essentially rest assured that you are then running the best version of your body you possibly can.
So that means taking responsibility for your actions and seeing what type of effects that has on your body.
That's exactly
your sleep, your diet, how you view the world, and being almost kind of a detective to the best version of your health.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, the challenge historically has been, if I'm the detective trying to figure out what should I do to be the best me I can be, to be the healthiest me I can be, there's been two challenges with that. One, we haven't understood health at the concrete cellular and molecular level anywhere near as well as we do at the moment. So there is, over probably the next 5 to 10 years or so, going to be a sea change in how much information we have about our bodies. Right now, as you know, there's lots of industrial influence or industrial interest in DNA genetics. There's 23andMe, all kinds of other genome testing firms. People in doctors' offices are testing for DNA polymorphisms and their influence on disease all the time. But guess what? DNA sequence itself has very little to do with who gets a disease and who doesn't get a disease. Most of that is life bouncing off of the DNA, not the DNA cursing you to a particular disease.
It's not necessarily one particular change or polymorphism that will, affect us that much.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. And if that were the case, then we'd all die pretty quick, right?
Right.
I mean, when I get cancer when I'm 60 years old, that's not because suddenly my DNA has sort of like up and changed all these polymorphisms. It's by and large because of ways in which my body, there's a certain amount of genomic damage that drives cancer. That's the kind of the key insult in the first place. But most cancers themselves burn out and die. What allows a cancer to kind of get a good first jump out of where it's born and into the rest of my body, which is actually what we're really worried about in cancer, right?
It escapes the immune system.
Yeah, it escapes the immune system and it gets all over the body.
Yeah.
If a cancer stays in one place, usually a surgeon can cut it out. So we love that, right? I mean, we throw people into these imaging systems and figure out where the cancer is and cut all that stuff out. That's great, super curative. But if the cancer cells figure out how to escape into other parts of the body, we can't keep chopping out all the various different parts of your body cancer cells can, sort of lurk in. So that's a good example of a situation where the initial insult is genetic damage, but then you have this stress biology helping to promote this metastasis biology, the escape of a cell from, a cancer cell from where it's originally born. So that's one concrete example of how the life that we lead, the life circumstances that we inhabit, the lifestyle, the things that we do shape the way this molecular biology works that translates into a difference in the, sort of likelihood or speed of a disease.
Right. So we know pretty much every lifestyle input affects the way our genes are turned on or turned off. We know that sleep is involved, diet, nutrition, and stress plays a big factor, as we've discussed. Are there anything in the genes that kind of tell us philosophically how we should live as human beings? There's some research that I know you've discussed on eudaimonic happiness and the sense of purpose.
Yeah, what is this eudaimonic happiness crap? Where did that come from, right? So for years, I've been studying miserable ways to live, because that's what the NIH pays me to do, right? Is like find some risk factor and figure out how it turns into a disease. So I've studied poverty, post-traumatic stress, just loneliness and social isolation, all kinds of bad ways of being. And I have a very high tolerance for negative emotional states. But even I, at some point, was just like, man, this is depressing. Is there no redemption to human life? What can we do to make this better? So I started looking around for what might be the protective factors that help people stay healthy even though they're confronting really adverse life circumstances. And a lot of the things that people, might think off the top of their heads were good, like having lots of positive emotion, turns out, that's mostly staying in your head. That doesn't seem to be trickling down, let's say, to your white blood cells. But one of the things that really surprised me was that when we were looking at other types of happiness, not what we call hedonic well-being, which is the kind of the happiness that comes from kind of momentary euphoria and feeding our sensory systems beautiful sights or tasty food or something like that.
Driving a nice car.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. There's another version of happiness, a more inconvenient one that, probably your grandmother has told you about, or Aristotle or something like that, which is the kind of happiness that comes from doing something good or important. And that's what they mean by eudaimonic well-being. It's the type of happiness that isn't quite so euphorically mirthful, but is more kind of deeply satisfied because you've done something that you think is really significant you've discovered something, created something, helped the world be a better place somehow. Interestingly enough, people who have high levels of that eudaimonic well-being, a high sense of purpose in life and a high sense of sort of engagement in something pro-social, they show really good-looking gene expression profiles. And I was completely shocked when we bumped into this because, you know, I sort of thought of that as like flowery philosophical well-being, not stuff that actually is programmed to live in your body. But sure enough, people with high sense of purpose and meaning in life, their gene expression profiles look like relatively low-stress people, even when they're in fairly stressful life circumstances. And we're really interested in understanding how that happens. What's the neurobiology that allows you, if you've got a sense of purpose, to be well in the midst of chaos? So that's actually one of the central areas of research we conduct these days, is trying to understand how does purpose marshal the body's resources and pull up a good order off of the menu of gene expression potential that we have in our DNA, even when we're living in tough, adverse life circumstances.
That's very interesting. That basically is saying those people with that sense of purpose are feeling like they're doing something to better the world. Our gene is gifting them with better health.
That's what it looks like. I mean, probably not the intent of the genes, right? But it looks like, for, you know, by the accidents or grand design of, you know, experience, people that do that seem to have a more favorable gene expression profile, and that's got to be shaped by evolution somehow. So it's as though we've evolved to be good people. That's when we're at our best. So when we think about what we can do, it's important not to just think about what we ourselves do, what kind of exercise I have or food I eat, but what can I do for the world? What can I do to make the world a better place? Who can I help? What can I create? What can I discover? What can I help make come true as a dream?
Thanks again for joining us on our segment on epigenetics. And remember, we're all born with the same DNA, but very few diseases are actually inherited. It's actually how you live your life. It's your diet, it's exercise, it's stress reduction, and it's how you sleep. And as we learned today from Dr. Cole, are you living your life with purpose?
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Thrive State podcast. And if this podcast is bringing a lot of value to you, if you find that your life is just improving with this podcast, that your life is getting to the next level, please consider supporting it. And here's a few ways you can do so. You can do so by liking this video and commenting on this video, and also sharing this video with your friends and family. Another thing you can do is go to ratethispodcast.com/ThriveState. Go ahead and leave us a 5-star review there. It will really, really help this show grow. And this will give me more time so that I could actually give more content to you, just like you got in this episode. And if you haven't already picked up a copy of my book, Thrive State, Your Blueprint for Optimal Health, Longevity, and Peak Performance, you can pick it up now. It became a #1 new release in longevity. Go to thrivestatebook.com. And if you enjoy the book, please consider leaving us a review as well. And the last thing you can do, if you're liking everything here and you want to work more closely with me as well as my team to get you into the Thrive State, go to kienvuu.com/accelerator and consider joining the home course, the Thrive State Accelerator. It's really the course that I use. It's the concepts that I use personally when I work with CEOs, celebrities, and my high-profile clients to get them to the Thrive State. Again, the Thrive State Accelerator at kienvuu.com/accelerator. And because you're a listener of this podcast, I want you to save 25% by using the coupon code podcast25. I hope we continue to give value to you. And remember always, you are your best medicine.